The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Lincoln Heights Community Center, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor as Marcus Thompson, fresh from basketball practice, expertly spun his favorite Wilson basketball on his right index finger, the familiar leather grip giving him comfort as he headed toward the locker room. The prestigious facility had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could forget about the weight of being the FBI chief's son and just be another talented athlete chasing his hoop dreams. The peaceful atmosphere of the upscale gym shattered when Kevin Henderson, who had been pretending to check her phone while watching Marcus for the past 10 minutes, suddenly stepped directly into his path, her Gucci handbag swinging from her bony arm like a designer weapon, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching her iPhone 15 Pro Max as if it were a shield against imagined threats. Her blonde hair, styled in an expensive cut that screamed privilege, bobbed aggressively as she planted herself firmly in front of the teenager. Marcus could smell her overwhelming designer perfume, mixing unpleasantly with the fresh scent of his own hard-earned sweat. As she invaded his personal space, her eyes narrowing with unwarranted suspicion, while other gym members began to slow their walks toward the exit, some already sensing the impending confrontation. The security cameras, high in the corners of the lobby, whirred quietly as they adjusted to capture every moment of what was about to unfold. Wearing his Lincoln Heights Warriors basketball jersey, drenched in honest effort from 3 hours of intense practice, Marcus stood a full foot taller than Karen, but he immediately made himself less imposing by relaxing his shoulders and offering a friendly smile, just as his mother had taught him during countless dinner table conversations about navigating these exact situations. His gym bag, heavy with gear, hung casually from his left shoulder, while his right hand continued to spin the basketball, a subtle demonstration of his legitimate presence in this athletic space. Karen Henderson, whose monthly membership fee was probably equal to some family's entire grocery budget, took another aggressive step forward, her voice rising to a pitch that could crack glass as she demanded to see his membership card, her tone suggesting she was judge, jury, and executioner of who belonged in this exclusive space. Even though she held no official position at the facility, her Louboutin heels clicked against the floor like an angry metronome as she shifted her weight, ready to launch into what was clearly not her first confrontation of this nature. The handful of remaining gym members in the lobby had completely stopped pretending to mind their own business now, some looking uncomfortable but remaining silent, while others already had their phones out recording what they recognized as a familiar scene playing out in yet another public space. The late afternoon sun continued its journey across the lobby floor, creating a dramatic stage for this unrequested performance. Marcus kept his composure, remembering his mother's words about excellence being the best response to ignorance, his varsity letter visible on his jersey, his team captain patch gleaming under the lobby lights, and his state championship ring catching the sunlight as he maintained his practiced calm in the face of her escalating hostility, his basketball still spinning steadily, becoming a physical manifestation of his maintained dignity in the face of her baseless accusations. The security guard behind the front desk, Ryan, who'd known Marcus since his freshman year, started to stand up, ready to intervene, but Karen was already in full performance mode, her voice echoing off the lobby's high ceilings as she clutched her designer bag closer to her chest, as if Marcus, 6 feet away, was somehow threatening her personal space with his mere existence in this shared facility where he'd been practicing 3 times a week for the past 2 years, leading his team to their first state championship in a decade. The tension in the lobby crystallized as Marcus drew a steady breath, channeling the countless conversations he'd had with his mother about staying composed in the face of prejudice, his fingers still expertly spinning the basketball as he spoke in the calm, measured tone that had won him multiple debating competitions at Lincoln Heights, high, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had helped him lead his team through tight games. Coach Williams personally recruited me for the varsity team 2 years ago, Marcus explained, gesturing toward the championship banners hanging in the lobby, several of which bore his name as team captain, while Karen continued to grip her phone like it was a lifeline, her artificial nails scraping against its pristine surface as her eyes darted between Marcus and the growing crowd of witnesses who had paused their workouts to observe the unfolding scene. The sound of Karen's finger jabbing at her phone screen echoed through the now silent lobby as she dramatically punched in 911, her voice rising to a theatrical pitch that bounced off the facility's modern architecture while she paced in a tight circle, her designer heels marking aggressive clicks against the marble floor. Like a metronome counting down to an inevitable confrontation, her free hand gesturing wildly as she began spinning her fictional tale to the emergency dispatcher. "There's a threatening individual in the Lincoln Heights Community Center," she practically shouted into her phone, while several gym members exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads in disappointment as they recognized the familiar pattern of weaponized privilege playing out before them. Brian, the security guard, was now standing at his desk, his hand hovering over the internal phone line direct to the facility manager, while Karen continued her performance. "He's refusing to leave, and I'm afraid for my safety," her voice cracking with manufactured fear. Marcus had already pulled out his own phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen as he opened his live stream app, a habit his mother had insisted he develop after similar incidents began plaguing his teammates, the red recording light blinking steadily as he documented Karen's escalating behavior, his followers count climbing rapidly as notifications of the stream spread across social media platforms like wildfire through the local community. The late afternoon sun continued its journey across the lobby, casting long shadows that seemed to underscore the absurdity of the situation as Karen described Marcus as an aggressive intruder while he stood calmly in his varsity jersey, still damp from practice, his state championship ring visible as he held his phone steady, capturing every moment of her increasingly frantic accusations, the security cameras above continuing their silent vigil as additional witnesses to the truth. Several of Marcus' teammates who had lingered after practice began emerging from the locker room, their voices dying mid-conversation as they assessed the situation, their own phones quickly joining the documentation effort as Karen spun an increasingly elaborate narrative to the 911 dispatcher about feeling threatened by their team captain, whose leadership had just last week been praised in the local newspaper for organizing a youth basketball clinic for underprivileged kids. The community center's front doors swished open as more members arrived for the evening workouts, the scene before them freezing them in place as they became unwitting audience members to Karen's desperate performance, her voice growing more shrill with each passing moment as she realized her claims were being met with skepticism rather than the immediate support she had clearly expected from her fellow gym members, some of whom had already begun posting their own videos of the incident with hashtags that would soon trend across local social media. Marcus maintained his composure even as his live stream count surged past 5,000 viewers, his mother's training evident in every calculated breath and measured movement, while Karen continued her frantic pacing, her designer outfit becoming increasingly disheveled as she worked herself into a state of manufactured hysteria that contrasted sharply with the teen's pointed serenity, the afternoon light streaming through the windows illuminating the stark difference between accusation and reality as the sound of approaching sirens began to whisper in the distance. Red and blue lights painted urgent patterns across the community center's glass facade as two police cruisers pulled up to the entrance, their sirens cutting off in perfect synchronization, leaving behind an electric silence that hummed through the lobby. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez emerged from their vehicles, their movements measured and professional as years of training kicked in, though their expressions shifted subtly as they took in the scene through the glass doors. Officer Johnson, a veteran of 15 years on the force, reached the entrance first, her hand instinctively resting near her weapon until her experienced eyes assessed the situation before her, a composed teenager in a varsity basketball jersey, still damp from practice, his phone steady in one hand, broadcasting to what had now grown to over 10,000 livestream viewers, while a woman in designer clothes paced frantically, her previous confidence seemingly evaporating as multiple cameras documented her behavior. The automatic doors whispered open, admitting the officers into the climate-controlled lobby, where the temperature felt several degrees cooler than the tension that had been building. Marcus maintained his position, his mother's voice echoing in his memory about the importance of slow, deliberate movements in situations like these, while Carol immediately rushed toward the officers, her gulchy bag swinging wildly as she attempted to secure immediate allies in her manufactured crisis. Officer Rodriguez, who had played basketball himself through college, noticed the state championship ring on Marcus' finger and the captain patch on his jersey, his trained eye also taking in the security cameras, the witnesses with phones recording, and most notably the young man's calm demeanor, which stood in stark contrast to the complaint they'd received about a threatening individual refusing to leave the facility. "Ma'am, please step back," Officer Johnson commanded as Karen attempted to launch into her narrative, her voice carrying the weight of authority that came from handling countless similar situations throughout her career, while her partner moved to create space between the accuser and the accused, his body language communicating years of experience in de-escalating charged confrontations. The gathered crowd of gym members had grown larger, their phones still recording as Karen struggled to maintain her story in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. Brian, the security guard, had pulled up the day's security footage on his monitor and was already queuing specific timestamps that showed Marcus arriving for practice hours earlier with his team, while Officer Rodriguez began taking statements from witnesses who had observed the entire interaction. Marcus' livestream count continued to climb as local news stations began picking up the feed, his composed responses to the officers' questions providing a stark contrast to Karen's increasingly desperate attempts to justify her actions to Officer Johnson, who had already noted the tremor in the woman's voice that often accompanied false reports, her experienced ears picking up the telltale signs of a story unraveling under scrutiny. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the lobby floor as Officer Rodriguez spoke quietly into his radio, requesting additional information about similar calls from the area, his years of experience suggesting this wasn't the first time such an incident had occurred. While Karen grew increasingly agitated as she realized her audience was not responding with the sympathy and support she had clearly expected. Several of Marcus' teammates had formed a loose semicircle nearby, their phones still recording as they provided backup copies of the live stream to both officers, their presence a silent testament to their captain's character. While Karen repeatedly checked her own phone, her earlier confidence replaced by growing uncertainty as she noticed the local community center's social media accounts had already begun sharing the incident with hashtags that were rapidly gaining traction. Officer Johnson had just begun to ask Marcus about his regular practice schedule when the distinctive sound of another vehicle approaching caught everyone's attention, the low purr of a government-issue engine cutting through the relative quiet that had settled over the scene. The officers exchanged knowing looks as they recognized the sound of official transportation, while Karen remained oblivious to the approaching presence that would dramatically shift the dynamics of her rapidly deteriorating position in the unfolding drama. The sleek black government-issue SUV rolled silently into the parking lot, its tinted windows reflecting the late afternoon sun as it came to a precise stop in the space reserved for law enforcement, the vehicle bearing the subtle but unmistakable markings of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, its mere presence causing a ripple of whispers through the crowd gathered at the community center's windows, while Officers Johnson and Rodriguez straightened, unconsciously recognizing the weight of authority that accompanied such an arrival. Special Agent in Charge Diana Thompson emerged from the vehicle, her movements carrying the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable in high-stakes operations and congressional briefings, her navy suit tailored to perfection concealing the shoulder holster that held her service weapon, while her FBI badge caught the sunlight as it hung from her hip, her stern expression a masterpiece of professional neutrality cultivated over 2 decades of breaking barriers in federal law enforcement. The automatic doors parted before her, as if sensing her authority, her heel strikes against the marble floor, echoing with purpose through the now hushed lobby, where Karen Henderson had frozen mid-sentence, her previous bravado evaporating like morning mist in the face of this unexpected development. while Marcus maintained his composed stance, though a slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he watched his mother command the space without speaking a single word. Diana surveyed the scene with the same analytical precision that had earned her the highest case closure rate in bureau history, her eyes taking in every detail from the witnesses still recording with their phones to the security guard Brian, whose hand still hovered over his monitor displaying the day's footage, to the local officers who had responded to the call, their postures conveying immediate recognition of her reputation within the law enforcement community. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate Diana as she moved through the lobby, her presence transforming the space into an unofficial federal jurisdiction, while Karen appeared to shrink into herself, her designer outfits suddenly seeming like an inadequate shield against the reality of her situation as she watched the FBI chief approach, her previous confidence crumbling under the weight of dawning recognition. Officer Johnson stepped forward to brief the special agent in charge, but Diana raised one perfectly manicured hand in a gesture that politely but firmly indicated she had already assessed the situation, her eyes moving from the security cameras to her son's still active live stream to the growing crowd of witnesses, before finally settling on Karen with an intensity that had broken hardened criminals during countless interrogations. Marcus' teammates, who had maintained their supportive semicircle throughout the confrontation, straightened their postures instinctively, several of them recognizing Diana from the times Shed attended their games, though Shed always insisted on sitting in the regular bleachers, refusing the special treatment her position might have warranted, their phones still recording as this new chapter of the incident unfolded. The tension in the lobby shifted, becoming something more refined, more focused as Diana took another step forward, her movements measured and deliberate, while Karen clutched her designer bag like a life preserver, her earlier accusations dying in her throat as she faced not just the mother of the teen Shed profiled, but one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the state, the same official whose recent press conference on bias incidents had gone viral just last month. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez exchanged knowing looks, their years of experience telling them this situation had just evolved far beyond a routine call, as Diana Thompson stood in the center of the lobby, her presence bridging the worlds of mother and federal authority figure, while the community center's social media notifications continued to buzz with activity as news of her arrival spread through local networks like wildfire, the story transforming from a routine incident of profiling into something that would soon command national attention. Special Agent in Charge Diana Thompson stood in the center of the Lincoln Heights Community Center lobby, her presence transforming the space into an unofficial extension of her federal office, as she assessed the situation with the same tactical precision that had earned her the nickname Oracle among her fellow agents, her dark eyes missing nothing as they swept across the scene, gathering details that would later become critical evidence. Her gaze softened momentarily as it landed on Marcus, a flash of maternal pride crossing her features as she noted his composed stance and active live stream, before her expression hardened into what her colleagues called her interrogation face as she turned toward Karen Henderson, who had begun to back away unconsciously, her designer heels clicking uncertainly against the marble floor as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. Diana took 3 measured steps forward, her movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who had navigated countless high-stakes situations, while Karen clutched her Gucci bag tighter, her perfectly manicured fingers turning white with tension as she recognized the woman from countless press conferences and news reports about major FBI operations, the same woman whose appointment as the first African American female special agent in charge had made headlines across the state. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast Diana's shadow long across the lobby floor, creating a visual representation of her authority that seemed to stretch toward Karen like an approaching tide, while officers Johnson and Rodriguez maintained their positions, their own body language communicating their deference to the federal agent whose reputation for handling civil rights violations had become legendary within law enforcement circles. Marcus maintained his live stream, his followers now numbering in the tens of thousands, as news of his mother's arrival spread through social media channels like wildfire, while Karen's earlier accusations seemed to evaporate in the face of the FBI chief's presence, her previous confidence replaced by the dawning realization that her impulsive decision to profile a teenage athlete had escalated into a confrontation with one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the state. Diana's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the weight of 2 decades of federal service, its tone calibrated to the perfect frequency of authority that had extracted confessions from hardened criminals. As she addressed Karen, "My son has been a member of this facility for 2 years, Miss Henderson," her words precise and measured, while the gathered crowd held their collective breath, hanging on every syllable of what was quickly becoming a masterclass in professional intimidation. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, no sound emerging, as she struggled to process the revelation that the suspicious teenager she had reported was not only an honored student athlete, but the son of an FBI chief whose recent task force on racial profiling had made national headlines. While Diana continued to close the distance between them, her badge catching the light with each deliberate step forward. The security footage continued to play silently on Brian's monitor behind the front desk, showing the earlier events in an endless loop that would soon become evidence as Diana's trained eye caught the cameras recording every moment of the current confrontation, her years of experience already formulating how this incident would be documented, prosecuted, and ultimately used as a teaching moment in federal law enforcement training sessions. Marcus' teammates had unconsciously shifted their positions, forming a loose semicircle that mirrored the one they often created on the basketball court, their phones still recording as they witnessed their team captain's mother demonstrate why she had earned her reputation as one of the most formidable figures in federal law enforcement, while Karen seemed to physically shrink, her designer outfit no longer projecting the authority she had wielded so carelessly just minutes before. The downtown courthouse buzzed with anticipation as Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen prepared to present the security footage, her reputation for handling high-profile civil rights cases making her the perfect choice to prosecute this incident that had captured national attention. The massive screens positioned strategically around the courtroom hummed to life as the first frame appeared, showing the Lincoln Heights Community Center lobby bathed in afternoon sunlight. Karen Henderson sat at the defense table, her previously confident demeanor replaced by nervous finger tapping against the polished wood as she watched herself appear on screen, her designer outfit from that day a stark contrast to the more subdued courtroom attire her lawyer had insisted she wear today. While the jury leaned forward in their seats, their attention captured by the high-definition footage that was about to unravel her carefully constructed narrative. The first video angle showed Marcus entering the facility with his teammates for practice hours before the incident, his varsity jacket and gym bag clearly visible as he greeted Brian, the security guard, with a familiar fist bump, while ADA Chen methodically established the timeline that would prove Karen's claims of him sneaking in were entirely fabricated, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom as she highlighted key details that contradicted the defense's story. Social media clips from Marcus' followers began playing next, their smartphones having captured angles the security cameras missed as Karen's voice filled the courtroom through multiple speakers, her tone growing increasingly hostile with each passing moment, while the jury members exchanged knowing glances, some taking detailed notes as the evidence mounted against her previous claims of feeling threatened by the teenage athlete. Diana Thompson sat in the front row of the gallery, her presence commanding attention even in silence as she watched the proceedings, her years of FBI experience allowing her to notice subtle reactions from the jury as they witnessed Karen following Marcus through the lobby, her aggressive body language clearly visible in high definition, while her son maintained remarkable composure throughout the confrontation. Officer Johnson's body camera footage added another devastating layer to the prosecution's case, showing Karen's dramatic shift in behavior upon realizing Marcus's mother's identity, the color draining from her face as Special Agent in Charge Thompson approached her that day, the courtroom remaining silent as they watched the moment Karen's privilege collided with federal authority in crystal clear resolution. Ada Chen moved methodically through the evidence, her presentation highlighting key moments from multiple angles as Karen's defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair, knowing each new piece of footage further demolished their already weak defense strategy, while reporters in the gallery furiously took notes, their pens scratching against notepads as they documented what was quickly becoming a landmark case in their jurisdiction. The security footage timeline continued showing Karen's previous visits to the community center, revealing a pattern of behavior that the prosecution had uncovered during their investigation. Her interactions with other members of color displayed on screen, creating a damning portrait of systematic harassment that had gone unchallenged until she finally targeted the wrong teenager on the wrong day. Marcus's live stream footage played last, its viral reach now having exceeded millions of views, as it showed Karen's unwarranted aggression from yet another angle, while the jury watched her desperate attempts to justify her actions crumble in real time. The comments and reactions from viewers scrolling across the bottom of the screen demonstrating the immediate public response to her behavior. The afternoon sun streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to spotlight Karen as she sank further into her chair, each new piece of evidence stripping away another layer of her defense, while Ada Chen prepared to call her first witness, the weight of the video evidence hanging heavy in the courtroom air as the prosecution prepared to demonstrate that this incident was not an isolated moment of poor judgment, but rather a pattern of behavior that demanded accountability. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as Marcus Thompson approached the witness stand, his Lincoln Heights Warriors varsity jacket worn like a badge of honor over his crisp white shirt and tie, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor as he moved with the same controlled confidence he displayed on the basketball court, while every eye in the packed gallery followed his progress. Raising his right hand to take the oath, Marcus's championship ring caught the light streaming through the courthouse windows, his clear, steady voice carrying to the back row as he promised to tell the truth, his mother's years of guidance evident in his composed demeanor, while Karen Henderson seemed to shrink further into her expensive suit, each passing moment making her actions seem more indefensible. Ada Chen approached the witness stand, her questions carefully crafted to let Marcus tell his story in his own words, as he described growing up as the son of an FBI chief, learning from an early age how to navigate spaces where people made assumptions about him based on his skin color, his testimony painting a vivid picture of the constant calculations required just to make others feel comfortable with his presence. The jury listened intently as Marcus recounted his achievements: class president, varsity captain, youth mentor, his accolades standing in stark contrast to Karen's assumptions about him that day, while several jurors wiped tears from their eyes as he described how his mother had prepared him for moments exactly like this, teaching him to remain calm in the face of prejudice, even as his heart raced with the unfairness of it all. Marcus' voice remained steady as he described his regular routine at the community center, the familiar faces, the security guards who knew him by name, the younger kids who looked up to him as he helped coach youth basketball clinics, his words weaving a tapestry of community involvement that made Karen's claims of him being an intruder seem increasingly absurd with each detail he shared. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the courtroom as Marcus explained how he'd felt in that moment, standing in the lobby with Karen demanding to see his membership card, his mother's training kicking in, as he maintained his composure even as his teammates watched their captain face the kind of situation they'd discussed in locker room conversations too many times before. Diana Thompson sat perfectly still in the gallery, her FBI training allowing her to maintain a professional figure even as maternal pride burned bright in her eyes, while her son demonstrated the poise and dignity she'd worked so hard to instill in him, knowing that as a young black man his margin for error in such situations was non-existent. Karen's defense attorney shifted papers on his desk, avoiding eye contact as Marcus detailed how the incident had affected him not just personally but as a leader in his school community, his words resonating with the diverse crowd in the gallery as he described the responsibility he felt to turn this moment into a movement for change. Reporters' laptops clicked softly as they captured every word Marcus spoke, their social media feeds already lighting up with quotes from his testimony, while the jury remained focused entirely on the young man, whose composure in the face of prejudice had transformed a routine incident of profiling into a national conversation about privilege and accountability. Marcus' voice grew stronger as he described his decision to live stream the incident, explaining how his mother had always taught him to document everything, his testimony revealing the strategic thinking behind his calm exterior. That day, while Karen stared at her hands, unable to meet the steady gaze of the teenager whose character shapes so grievously misjudged. The sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to illuminate Marcus as he concluded his testimony, his final words landing with the same precision he'd learned to use on the basketball court, as he emphasized that this case wasn't just about him, but about every person who'd ever faced similar treatment, without having an FBI chief or a mother to ensure justice was served. Karen Henderson approached the witness stand, her designer heels no longer clicking with their usual confidence against the courthouse floor, her carefully selected powder blue suit, meant to convey innocence, instead highlighting the nervous sweat beginning to show at her temples as she raised her trembling right hand to take the oath, while the packed gallery watched in complete silence. Ade Chen began her cross-examination with surgical precision, producing a thick folder of previous incidents that would soon unravel Karen's carefully constructed image, starting with security footage from a local coffee shop 3 months earlier, where she'd called the police on a black medical student studying for his board exams, claiming he was loitering despite his multiple receipt purchases. Karen's voice grew increasingly defensive as she attempted to explain away her pattern of behavior, her previously practiced responses crumbling under the weight of video evidence, while the jury watched. Her hands gripped the witness stand so tightly her knuckles turned white, her expensive manicure catching the afternoon light as she struggled to maintain her composure. The prosecution methodically presented case after case, building a damning timeline of Karen's interactions with people of color throughout the community center and beyond, her calls to police becoming a disturbing pattern that stretched back months, security footage from various establishments playing on the courtroom screens, while she attempted to justify each incident with increasingly desperate explanations. Sweat began to bead on Karen's forehead as Ade Chen reviewed phone records showing her history of 911 calls, each one following a similar pattern of targeting minorities in public spaces, her voice growing smaller with each new piece of evidence, while several jury members shook their heads in visible disappointment, their notepads filling with damaging details that would soon factor into their deliberations. Diana Thompson sat motionless in the gallery, her years of FBI interrogation experience allowing her to recognize the telltale signs of a witness unraveling as Karen's testimony contradicted itself multiple times, her attempts to paint herself as the victim falling apart under the skilled questioning of the prosecution, while reporters furiously documented every damaging admission. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Karen's face as she attempted to explain her actions at the community center that day, her voice cracking as she tried to justify why she'd assumed Marcus had no right to be there, despite his varsity jacket championship ring and the security guard's obvious familiarity with him, her excuses sounding hollow, even to her own ears. Ade Chen produced enlarged screenshots from Marcus's live stream showing Karen's aggressive body language and confrontational stance, while she claimed to feel threatened, her previous statements about fearing for her safety contradicted by clear video evidence of her pursuing the teenager through the lobby, her testimony dissolving into a series of weak, "I don't recalls and I can't remembers." The jury's attention remained fixed on Karen as she struggled to explain why she hadn't simply asked the front desk about Marcus's membership, her inability to provide a reasonable explanation highlighting the racial assumptions that had driven her actions, while her defense attorney slumped slightly in his chair, knowing each response only damaged their case further. Karen's composed facade finally crackled completely as Ade Chen revealed social media posts showing her history of complaints about diversifying neighborhood demographics, her private Facebook comments about keeping certain spaces exclusive, now displayed on the courtroom screens, while she sat trapped in the witness stand forced to confront her own documented prejudices. The weight of evidence pressed down on Karen like a physical force as the prosecution connected each dot of her past behavior, creating an undeniable picture of systematic harassment, her voice barely above a whisper, as she faced questions about her true motivations that day in the community center, while the afternoon light continued its journey across the courtroom, illuminating the truth she could no longer hide. Thunderous applause erupted outside the courthouse as the jury forewoman read the guilty verdict, her clear voice carrying through the packed courtroom, while hundreds of supporters gathered on the steps outside watched the proceedings live on their phones, their cheers echoing through the historic downtown district as justice was finally served. Marcus Thompson stood tall, surrounded by his entire basketball team, their varsity jackets creating a sea of Lincoln Heights Warriors colors as reporters thrust microphones toward him, his composed voice carrying the same strength it had shown throughout the trial as he addressed the media about transforming this moment of injustice into a movement for lasting change. Diana Thompson stood proudly beside her son, her FBI badge catching the afternoon sunlight as she wrapped one arm around his shoulders, her professional demeanor softening into maternal pride as she watched him handle the press conference with the same grace, head displayed throughout the entire ordeal, her presence a powerful symbol of the intersection of justice and family. Karen Henderson was escorted toward the community service office, her designer heels replaced by practical flats, as she prepared to begin her mandated hours at the very same community center where her prejudice had finally met its match. The irony lost on no one as she walked past the basketball court where Marcus and his teammates now coached youth clinics. Social media exploded with reaction to the verdict, hashtags trending nationwide as Marcus's original live stream gained millions of new views, his calm dignity in the face of discrimination becoming required viewing in corporate sensitivity training sessions, while law enforcement departments across the country began incorporating the case into their bias prevention programs. The Lincoln Heights Community Center transformed in the wake of the verdict, installing a new training program developed by Diana Thompson and Marcus, combining his experience as a youth mentor with her expertise in civil rights enforcement, their mother-son partnership creating a model for other facilities nationwide as they worked to prevent similar incidents. Marcus' teammates lined the courthouse steps, their phones raised high, streaming the moment lived to their growing social media following as their captain spoke about using their platform as athletes to challenge systemic bias, his words inspiring a new generation of young leaders to stand up against discrimination with dignity and strategic documentation. Local news cameras captured Karen's first day of community service as she began working alongside the very teenagers shed once profiled her required sensitivity training, forcing her to confront her prejudices, while the center's security cameras now served as silent witnesses to her journey toward understanding and redemption. Diana Thompson addressed the press briefly, her years of FBI experience evident in every measured word, as she announced the creation of a new task force combining federal resources with community leadership to address racial profiling, her son's case becoming a catalyst for institutional change at both local and national levels. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the courthouse steps as Marcus hugged each of his teammates, their brotherhood strengthened by the trial, while college recruiters in the crowd whispered about his leadership qualities extending far beyond the basketball court, his handling of the incident already becoming legend in civil rights circles. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks as Marcus announced the creation of a new nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal support for victims of racial profiling, his experience inspiring him to ensure that others would have the resources to seek justice even without an FBI chief for a mother. The community center's youth basketball program flourished in the months following the verdict, with Marcus and his teammates volunteering as coaches, their presence drawing record numbers of young players eager to learn about both basketball and dignity under pressure, while Karen worked quietly in the background, her community service hours teaching her lessons no court could mandate. Diana Thompson watched proudly as her son concluded the press conference, his final words echoing through the crowd about how change happens one conversation, one consequence, one courtroom at a time, where the gathering of supporters erupted in renewed applause, their cheers carrying far beyond the courthouse steps to touch hearts and minds across the nation.